The air in the restaurant didn't just turn cold, it turned heavy. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the soft clink of a silver spoon dropping 3 tables away. But at the center table, there was only the sound of breathing. Director Shin sat back, his charcoal suit perfectly pressed, his eyes like glass. He had just placed a check on the linen tablecloth, a number with enough zeros to make a person's heart skip a beat. All he wanted was for the waitress, Simone Thorne, to nod, to take the money, sign the paper, and walk away from her history. The 2 men behind him, guys who had seen Shin dismantle CEOs without blinking, they were actually covering their mouths. They were terrified for her. They expected her to tremble or worse, to beg. But Simone, she didn't reach for the pen. She didn't even look at the money. She stood there, spine like a steel rod, her hands clasped softly in front of her. She looked at the most powerful man in the city not as a boss, but as a man who had finally met someone he couldn't buy. When she finally spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It was a whisper that cut through the room like a razor. And what she said didn't just insult him, it stripped him of his power in front of everyone. This isn't a story about a girl being rescued. This is a story about the moment a man who owned everything realized he was standing in the presence of someone he could never own. The polished brass doors of Eleklet didn't just open. They seemed to exhale as Director Shin stepped through. In this corner of Chicago, the air usually smelled of rain and old brick, but when Shin entered, he brought the scent of expensive sandalwood and the cold, metallic sharpness of a winter morning in Seoul. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. He moved with the practiced ease of a man who assumed every room he walked into already belonged to him. Behind him, 3 associates, men with names like Kendrick Vane and Vaughn Miller, trailed like shadows, their eyes darting nervously. They weren't just bodyguards, they were architects of his influence, and today they looked terrified. Simone Thorne felt the shift in the room before she saw him. She was polishing a crystal flute, her movements rhythmic, precise, almost meditative. She didn't startle when the heavy silence hit the dining room. She simply set the glass down. Simone wasn't just a waitress, she was a woman living a double life. By day, she navigated the dense, dusty volumes of property law, fighting a losing battle to save her grandmother's Victorian home from the South Side Renewal Project. By night, she wore this minimalist black uniform, serving the very people who were trying to pave over her childhood. Director Shin took his seat at table 12, the power seat. He didn't look at the menu. He sat back, one arm draped over the mahogany chair, his charcoal jacket pulling slightly across his broad shoulders. He looked bored until he looked at her. When Simone approached to take the order, the air between them became electric. It wasn't a romantic spark, it was a clash of frequencies. Shin's eyes were narrow, calculating, used to seeing people as obstacles or assets. He watched her walk, nodding the way she kept her chin parallel to the floor. Most people fumbled their pens or avoided his stare. Simone didn't. "The vintage Krug," Shin said, his voice a low, melodic rasp that carried a strange weight. He didn't say please. He didn't need to. Simone didn't flinch. "A fine choice, Director. Though, if you're here to discuss the District 4 rezoning, you might find the bitterness of the espresso more appropriate for the news coming out of the City Hall this morning." The table went dead silent. Vane and Miller actually gasped, one of them covering his mouth as if she'd just slapped a god. Shin didn't move. He just stared at her. For the first time in a decade, someone had looked through the suit, through the title, and saw the predator underneath. He didn't get angry. He got curious. And in Director Shin's world, curiosity was the most dangerous thing a person could provoke. He leaned back, his eyes tracing the stoic line of her jaw. "You have a name, waitress." "Simone," she replied, her voice steady as a heartbeat. "And I have a memory, which is more than I can say for the men you're meeting tonight." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a steady, defiant rhythm on the marble. Shin watched her go, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the kind of smile a hunter gives when he finds a trap he didn't set. 20 minutes later, the restaurant's atmosphere curdled. The heavy oak doors swung open again, admitting Councilman Sterling. Sterling was a man made of expensive silk ties and cheap promises. He sat down across from Shin, sweating despite the climate control, his face flushed with the kind of arrogance that only comes from inherited power. Simone arrived with the champagne, the bubbles rising in the glasses like tiny, trapped souls. As she poured, Sterling didn't even acknowledge her existence. He was too busy leaning in, his voice a loud, wet rasp. "It's a dump, Shin," Sterling laughed, waving a hand dismissively toward the window, toward the neighborhood Simone called home. "The whole block is a graveyard of old memories. We clear the Thorn property, we break the spirit of the local board, and the rest falls like dominoes. These people, they don't want progress. They want to rot in their history." Simone's hand remained perfectly still as she filled Sterling's glass. Not a single drop spilled, but inside her blood was turning to ice. The Thorn property, her grandmother's house, the heart of the block. "Is that so?" Shin asked softly. He wasn't looking at Sterling. He was watching Simone's eyes. He saw the flicker of fire, just a spark before she suppressed it. "And what of the residents, the displacement?" Sterling scoffed, taking a massive gulp of the krug. "Residents? You mean the help? Look at this place, Shin. You think the girl serving your wine cares about urban development? Give them a few months' rent and a voucher for a high-rise and they'll disappear. They don't have the spine for a real fight. They're just scenery." Sterling looked up then, finally noticing Simone. He smirked, reaching out a hand to flick a stray crumb off his sleeve toward her. "Isn't that right, sweetheart? You'd move for a nice paycheck, wouldn't you? Save yourself the commute from the slums." The associates at the table froze. Even Vane held his breath. The disrespect was so blatant, so jagged, it felt like a physical blow in the refined space of the restaurant. Simone didn't pull away. She stood her ground, her gaze shifting from the councilman to Director Shin. She realized in that moment that Shin wasn't joining in the laughter. He was testing the water. He was using Sterling's cruelty as a litmus test for her character. "The slums, Councilman," Simone said, her voice dropping an octave, "are where the people who build your city actually live. And history isn't something you clear. It's something that eventually buries men who think they can buy time." Sterling's face turned a deep, ugly purple. He slammed his hand on the table, the silver rattling. "You little—" "Quiet, Vance," Shin interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the authority of a closing casket. Shin stood up slowly, his height imposing, his presence swallowing the light. He looked at Simone, then at the red-faced councilman. The entire restaurant had gone silent. The chefs were peeking through the kitchen window, the other patrons had stopped chewing. "She has more spine in her silence than you have in your entire career, Sterling," Shin said coldly. Then he turned to Simone. "Follow me to the private lounge, Simone. I think it's time we discuss the price of your history." The private lounge was a tomb of velvet and shadow. Director Shin sat behind a desk of reclaimed oak, while Simone stood in the center of the room. She didn't sit. Sitting felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. Shin reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He didn't use a ballpoint. He used a fountain pen with a nib that looked like a needle. He wrote quickly, the scratching sound the only noise in the room. He tore the leaf off and slid it across the table. 7 figures, Shin said. "Enough to move your grandmother to a villa in France. Enough to finish that law degree you walked away from 3 years ago. Enough to never have to pour a drink for a man like Sterling again." Simone didn't look at the check. "And the catch?" "The catch is your silence." Shin leaned forward, the light catching the sharp angles of his face. "I know you overheard Sterling mention the zoning loophole. I saw it in your eyes. You know that if the city finds out we started demolition before the environmental impact report was filed, the entire $400 million project collapses. My firm would be liquidated. The city would be sued into the ground." He tapped the check. "Sign the deed to your grandmother's house over to my holding company tonight. Walk away. Forget you ever heard the word loophole. And you are a wealthy woman for the rest of your life." Simone finally looked at the check. It was a staggering amount. It was freedom. It was the end of her exhaustion, the end of the 12-hour shifts, the end of the fear of the debt collectors. "You're offering me a bribe to betray the only people who ever cared for me," Simone whispered. "I'm offering you an exit," Shin countered. The neighborhood is going to fall anyway, Simone. If not by my hand, then by someone much less generous than I am. Why burn your future for a pile of bricks that are already destined for dust? Simone walked to the desk. She picked up the check. Shin's associates, watching through the glass door, exhaled. They thought it was over. They thought everyone had a price. But Simone didn't put the check in her pocket. She held it between two fingers and looked Shin directly in the eye. You think you're a king because you can buy things, she said softly. But a king who has to buy loyalty is just a merchant in a fancy suit. Slowly, deliberately, she began to tear the check. Rip. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. Rip. She tore it into tiny, white confetti and let the pieces flutter onto his desk like snow. My grandmother taught me that a home isn't a property. It's an anchor. And you, Director Shin, you look like a man who has been drifting for a very long time. The silence that followed was absolute. Shin didn't move. He didn't blink. He just stared at the scraps of paper on his desk, then up at the woman who had just thrown a fortune into the trash to keep her dignity. For the first time in his life, Director Shin felt something he couldn't calculate: respect. Get out, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Simone turned and walked out, leaving him alone in the shadows. But as the door closed, Shin didn't call Sterling. He didn't call his lawyers. He picked up one of the torn pieces of paper and held it to the light, a strange, dark fire beginning to burn in his eyes. The game hadn't ended. It had just reached its first checkmate. The walk back to the locker room felt like moving through deep water. Every eye in El Eklat was pinned to Simone's back, some with pity, most with a terrified kind of awe. She could feel the heat of their stares, the whispered fragments of "did she really?" and "she's dead." But Simone didn't falter. She changed out of her uniform with steady hands, hanging the black fabric as if she were retiring armor. Outside, the Chicago night was crisp, the wind off the lake carrying the scent of salt and impending change. As she walked toward the train station, a black sedan with tinted windows pulled up to the curb, idling with a low, predatory hum. The window rolled down just an inch. It wasn't Director Shin. It was Kendrick Vane, his lead associate. His face was pale, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as if he were committing treason just by speaking to her. Ms. Thorne, he hissed, his voice trembling. You don't understand what you just did. That wasn't just a check. That was a peace treaty. The councilman is already calling the precinct. He wants you cited for harassment, or worse. He's going to make an example out of you to show Shin he's still in control of this district. Simone stopped, her hand tightening on her bag. And what does Director Shin want, Kendrick? To watch the show? Vane swallowed hard. The director, he hasn't said a word since you left the room. He's just sitting there, staring at the scraps of that check. But listen to me, Sterling is a cornered rat. He's already sent a cleanup crew to your grandmother's street, not to hurt anyone, but to make life impossible. Noise citations, water shutoffs, building inspectors with a grudge. He's going to starve you out before the sun rises. Simone looked at the man in the expensive car. Then he'd better bring a bigger shovel, because I'm not moving. She turned and disappeared into the mouth of the subway station. But as the train rattled toward the south side, the bravado began to crack. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. She saw a girl who had just turned down $10 million to protect a house that was already crumbling. Was it pride? Or was it the law student in her, the one who knew that once you let a man like Shin buy your silence, he owns your soul? When she arrived at her grandmother's house, the street was unnervingly quiet. No sirens, no inspectors, just the silhouette of the old Victorian, its wraparound porch glowing under a single yellow light. But sitting on the bottom step was something that shouldn't have been there. A single, white lily, pinned to a legal envelope. Simone opened it with shaking fingers. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a bribe. It was a copy of the very environmental impact report Shin said didn't exist. Attached was a sticky note with a sharp, elegant script. The first rule of a negotiation, Simone, never assume the opponent wants the same thing as the partner. Meet me at the construction site at midnight. Alone. It wasn't signed, but the scent of sandalwood clinging to the paper told her everything she needed to know. The redevelopment site was a skeletal wasteland of steel beams and orange mesh. At midnight, it looked like the ribcage of a dying giant. The wind whistled through the girders, sounding like a low moan. Simone arrived, her coat huddled around her, feeling the sheer scale of the power she was fighting. Director Shin was standing on a concrete slab that would eventually be the lobby of a luxury high-rise. He wasn't wearing his jacket now. His white shirt was stark against the darkness, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they were carved from granite. He was looking up at the sky, not the blueprints. "You came," he said without turning around. "I have a habit of facing my problems head-on," Simone replied, stepping over a coil of rebar. "Why the report, Shin? You told me it didn't exist. You offered me 10 million to pretend it didn't exist. Now you're handing it to me." Shin turned. In the moonlight, the quiet power he radiated was even more oppressive. He walked toward her until he was just inches away, his shadow swallowing hers. "Sterling thinks this project is about money," Shin said, his voice a low vibration. "He thinks it's about kickbacks and luxury condos. But for me, this was meant to be a legacy. My grandfather was an immigrant who built things with his hands, only to have men like Sterling take them away with a pen. I built this empire so no one could ever take anything from me again." He gestured to the ruins around them. "But I realized tonight, watching you tear up that check, that I have become the man with the pen. I have become the man my grandfather hated." Simone watched him, her breath hitching. "Is this a confession, Director, or a trap?" "It's a pivot," Shin said. "Sterling is moving against you. He's already filed the emergency demolition order for your block, claiming structural instability. He's bypassed my office entirely. He's going to level your home in 6 hours, Simone. And if I interfere publicly, my board of directors will remove me for breach of fiduciary duty." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "I can't stop him as Director Shin, but you can stop him as a citizen with that report. However, if you use it, you destroy the project. You destroy my company. You bankrupt thousands of investors." The dilemma landed like a physical weight. If she saved her home, she caused a financial massacre that would hurt innocent workers. If she stayed silent, her history was erased by a corrupt politician. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. "You're handing me the gun to shoot you." "Because," Shin said, his hand ghosting near her cheek but never touching, "I want to see if your integrity is a shield or a weapon. If you find a third way, Simone, a way to save the soul of this place without burning the temple, then you aren't just a waitress. You're the partner I've been looking for in a city of ghosts." He handed her a burner phone. "The bulldozers arrive at 6 a.m. You have 6 hours to be the lawyer you studied to be. Decide who you are." The next 4 hours were a blur of adrenaline and ink. Simone didn't go home. She went to the 24-hour law library at the university, her fingers flying over a keyboard, the environmental impact report spread out like a map of a battlefield. She realized Shin was right. The report was a double-edged sword. If she leaked the zoning loophole, the project died, but the neighborhood would remain a vacant lot for decades, tied up in litigation. The community would still suffer. She needed a third way. She began digging into the holding companies Shin used. She found something Sterling hadn't noticed. A legacy clause buried in the original 1920s land deed of the district. It stated that the land could only be redeveloped if the new structures provided equal or greater communal utility to the existing residents. Sterling's plan for luxury condos was a direct violation. But if the project was redesigned, if the renewal included low-income housing, a community center, and a deed trust that gave the residents ownership of the land, the project would be legal and Sterling's kickbacks would vanish. At 5:45 a.m., the roar of engines shook the south side. 3 massive yellow bulldozers sat idling at the edge of Simone Street. Councilman Sterling stood there, wearing a hard hat that looked ridiculous on him, flanked by a dozen police officers. A small crowd of neighbors had gathered, some crying, some shouting, held back by the yellow tape. "Move it," Sterling shouted through a megaphone. "The building is condemned. Move or be arrested." A black town car pulled up. Director Shin stepped out, looking immaculate, his expression a mask of cold indifference. He walked to Sterling's side. "You're early, Vance," Shin said. "Time is money, Shin. Let's get this over with," Sterling smirked. Just as the lead bulldozer lurched forward, a voice rang out, not a scream, but a command. "Stop." Simone Thorne stepped into the middle of the street. She wasn't in her waitress uniform. She wore a sharp, borrowed blazer, her hair tied back, holding a thick stack of notarized documents. "Councilman Sterling," she said, her voice carrying through the morning air like a bell. "I am Simone Thorne, acting legal counsel for the District 4 Community Trust. I am serving you with a federal injunction. This demolition is a violation of the 1924 Legacy Clause and the 2026 Environmental Protection Act." Sterling laughed, a jagged, nervous sound. "You're a waitress, honey. Get out of the way before we roll over you." "Check the signatures, Vance," Simone said, walking up to him and handing him the top sheet. Sterling's eyes scanned the page. His face went from red to a sickly, pale gray. At the bottom of the injunction, under the community board's names, was a second signature, a corporate guarantee. It was the signature of Shinvane Global. Director Shin hadn't stopped the demolition. He had reclassified the entire project. He had signed over 40% of the development's equity to a community trust managed by Simone Thorne. You betrayed me," Sterling stuttered, looking at Shin. Shin didn't even look at the councilman. He kept his eyes on Simone. "I didn't betray anyone, Vance. I simply chose a more sustainable partner. Your services are no longer required." The silence that followed wasn't the silence of a restaurant. It was the silence of a changing world. The bulldozer engines died one by one. The neighbors began to cheer, a low rumble that grew into a roar. Simone stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at Shin. He stood 10 feet away, a man who had just lost hundreds of millions in potential profit, but for the first time he didn't look bored. He looked alive. The fallout from the Battle of District 4 didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in the headlines. By noon, the image of Simone Thorne standing in front of a line of bulldozers had gone viral. But while the public saw a hero, the boardrooms of the city saw a revolution. In his penthouse office, Director Shin sat in a chair that cost more than Simone's annual salary, watching the sunset bleed over the skyline. He wasn't alone. Von Miller, his most senior associate, was packing the floor, his face a mask of panicked sweat. "The board is calling for your head, Shin," Miller shouted, gesturing wildly at a tablet displaying the plunging stock price of their holding company. "You gave away 40% of the equity. You turned a luxury gold mine into a social project. They're saying you've lost your mind, or that this waitress has some kind of leverage over you that we don't know about." Shin didn't look at him. He was twirling a heavy silver pen between his fingers, his eyes fixed on a small, framed photo of his grandfather. "They think it's a loss because they only know how to count what's in the vault, Vaughn. They don't see the liability of a riot. They don't see the cost of a neighborhood that hates the ground we build on." "But Sterling," Miller whispered, dropping his voice. "He's talking to the feds. He's going to pin the zoning illegalities on us to save his own skin. He's going to burn us down, Shin." Shin finally looked up, and for the first time Miller saw the Mafia in the director. It wasn't in a weapon or a threat. It was in the absolute, terrifying stillness of his gaze. "Sterling is a man who builds his house on sand. He thinks he's the architect, but he's just the dirt. Tell Kendrick to release the secondary files, not the ones about the project, the ones about Sterling's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands." As Miller scrambled out of the room, the private elevator chimed. Simone Thorne stepped out. She wasn't wearing the borrowed blazer anymore. She was back in her own clothes, jeans, and a simple sweater, but the way she carried herself had changed forever. She didn't look like a student or a waitress. She looked like the owner of the building. "You took a big risk this morning," Simone said, walking to the floor-to-ceiling window. "Giving up that equity, the board won't forgive that easily." "I don't seek forgiveness from men who have never bled for anything," Shin said, standing up. He walked over to her, stopping just at the edge of her personal space. The tension from the restaurant was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer a test, it was an acknowledgement. You found the third way, Simone. You didn't just stop the machines, you rewrote the blueprint. I did what was right, she said, meeting his gaze. But now comes the hard part. The neighborhood expects results. They expect you to actually build the community center. They expect the low-income housing to be real, not just a line in a contract. Shin leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rasp. Then stay. Don't go back to the restaurant. Don't go back to the library. I've created a new position, Director of Social Development. You hold the veto power over every project I start in this city. You'll be the conscience I've been trying to bury for 20 years. Simone looked at him, searching for the lie for the trap. You want to keep your enemy close, Director. No, Shin said, a rare, genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. I want to keep the only person who isn't afraid to tell me I'm wrong. The transition from the bistro to the executive suite wasn't a fairy tale. It was a war. For the next 3 months, Simone worked 16-hour days, not serving drinks, but deconstructing the corruption that had rotted the city's development board from the inside out. She was no longer the waitress. She was the thorn, a name spoken in hushed, fearful tones by contractors and politicians alike. But the higher she climbed, the more she realized that Shin's world was built on a foundation of dangerous secrets. One evening, while working late on the District 4 blueprints, Simone found a hidden file in the company's encrypted server. It wasn't about property or zoning. It was a list of protective payments made to various families in the city, families that had been displaced by Shin's father decades ago. She realized that Shin hadn't just been building a company. He had been quietly, secretly, paying reparations for his family's sins for years. He had been a mafia boss of a different kind, one who used his wealth to heal wounds that he couldn't publicly acknowledge. Just as she was closing the file, the lights in her office flickered and died. The silhouette of a man appeared in the doorway. It wasn't Shin. It was Councilman Sterling, his face gaunt, his eyes bloodshot and wild. He held a heavy manila folder in his hand, his knuckles white. You think you've won, don't you? Sterling spat, his voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and desperation. You and your director. You think you're so much better than me. But I have the records, Simone. I have the proof that Shin's father didn't just buy that land in the 80s, he took it. By force. People disappeared, Simone. And your precious director has been using social development as a laundry service for blood money. Simone stood up, her heart hammering. Whatever happened in the past, he's trying to fix it now, Vance, which is more than I can say for you. Fix it, Sterling laughed, a jagged, broken sound. He's just like me. He just has better tailors. If this file goes to the press, the community trust you love so much will be seized by the state as the proceeds of crime. Your grandmother's house, the community center, all of it will be gone. Unless... He stepped into the light, a desperate leer on his face. Unless you destroy the evidence I have against the Cayman accounts, one hand washes the other, Simone. Save your hero or save your neighborhood. You can't have both. Simone looked at the file. She knew the law. If Sterling was telling the truth, the entire foundation of her victory was built on a lie. She could protect Shin and keep the neighborhood safe, or she could be the lawyer she claimed to be and watch it all burn. The door opened behind Sterling. Shin was standing there, his face unreadable in the shadows. He had heard everything. Give him the file, Simone, Shin said quietly. What? Simone whispered. If the foundation is rotten, the house shouldn't stand, Shin said, walking into the room. He didn't look at Sterling, he looked only at her. I told you to be my conscience. If that means I lose everything, then that's the price of the truth. Don't protect me. Not after everything you've fought for. The scandal didn't destroy District 4. It transformed it. When Simone released the full truth, both the crimes of the past and the reparations of the present, the city didn't just see a mafia family. They saw a man who had been trying to pay a debt that could never be fully settled. Because Simone didn't just leak the file, she used her legal expertise to draft a historical reconciliation act. She turned the scandal into a legal precedent that forced the city to investigate all past displacements, not just the ones involving Shin. Director Shin resigned as CEO. The company was restructured into a public benefit corporation, with Simone Thorne as the chair of the board. 1 year later, the grand opening of the Thorne Community Center was the event of the season. The restaurant El Eklat provided the catering, but this time, the servers were treated with the same respect as the dignitaries. Simone stood on the balcony, looking down at the street where the bulldozers had once been. The neighborhood was thriving. The old Victorian houses stood proud next to modern, sustainable apartments. The history hadn't been erased, it had been integrated. A shadow fell over her. "The silence is different here," a familiar voice said. She turned to see Shin. He wasn't wearing a charcoal suit anymore. He wore a simple navy sweater, his hair a little longer, his expression no longer icy. He looked like a man who had finally stepped out of the shadows. "It's not the silence of fear," Simone said, smiling. "It's the silence of peace." "I have something for you," Shin said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper. It was a fragment of the check she had torn up a year ago, the one with the zeros. "I kept this to remind me of the moment I met someone I couldn't buy," he said, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. "But I realize now I don't want to buy you, Simone. I just want to walk beside you." He didn't offer her a check this time. He offered her a hand. Simone looked at the man who had started as her greatest threat and ended as her greatest ally. She didn't hesitate. She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, the contrast of their skin a beautiful, silent testament to the bridge they had built. "So," Simone said, her eyes twinkling with a bit of the old fire, "where do we build next?" Shin looked out over the city, the quiet power in him now directed toward something beautiful. "Wherever they tell us it's impossible, Simone, wherever they think we can't." They stood there together as the sun set over Chicago, the former waitress and the former boss, two people who had realized that the highest stakes in life aren't money or power, but the courage to be human in a world that wants you to be a machine.